I'm working on a new piece, a monophonic work, which will ultimately be presented in stereo, in binaural audio, and even in a Dolby Atmos immersive surround. But what makes it monophonic is that sound will always come from a single point in space at any given time. And that has me thinking about some of the earliest electronic music experiments. So when high-quality magnetic tape became available in the 1940s, people recorded everything they could get a microphone near.
We're going to begin with the unprepossessing recording of a door squeaking, such as this.
And it didn't take long for composers to get involved and begin to transform these recorded sounds, with the idea being to separate the source of the sound from the sound itself, so that it was less about what the sound was and more about how the sound felt and how it could be used in a musical context.
Could something as simple as that become a composition?
It could become a kind of composition. I, for one, would probably not find it a very satisfactory one until a great deal more were done.
Now, there are many ways to do this with a sound, and with tape recorders, a convenient way would be to lop off the beginning attack portion of a sound, the first couple hundred milliseconds, because when you do that, it becomes very difficult to identify what that sound is. You can also control the time domain. You can speed things up, slow them down, take the tape and reverse it.
Now, that was all done with a single sound. Therefore, of course, one can create by mixing a very complex texture, different textures, all from that single initial sound.
And these were recorded in mono, which had an unintended side effect, which is that mono is very poor at capturing the environmental context of a sound.
Two separate and distinct sound tracks. One from one side of the orchestra for one speaker system. Another track from the other side of the orchestra for the second speaker system.
And that is an important part of identifying a sound. And the reason is this: when a sound happens in space, sound waves propagate from that source and immediately begin reflecting off of the environment. And so while we hear some of the direct sound from the source, a lot of what we hear is all of the reflections, the interactions that the sound is having with its environment. So that environmental context is part of what makes that sound feel real.
Giving them the tremendous musical experience of living stereo.
And when you hear an old monophonic recording coming out of one speaker, it can be hard to tell what instruments are even playing at times. And so while this is a limitation of capturing sounds realistically, as a composer, this can become a creative advantage, because already working in mono, I can disguise the source of a sound and keep the focus on what makes it musically relevant. Now, many of these early experiments were done by technicians who had a very strong creative leaning. And what they produced is super important, and it opened up a completely new world of sound and way of thinking about sound. But for the most part, these were not the most musically engaging results. But eventually, traditional composers got involved in this process, and that's really what I am in background, and it's how I work, and it's what I'm really trying to pay homage to in this work.
One of the most interesting recent developments in electronic music is the introduction of computer-produced sound.
So now let's move into the studio and take a look at how this is working technically. One of the newest additions to my studio is a bit of modular gear, a Eurorack system by Roland called the System 500. It's really a collection of modules. It's a throwback, really a modern interpretation of a classic Roland synthesizer called the System 100. Now, most people get involved in modular synthesis because they want to move away from the computer and they want to create a complex network of generative sequencers. There's a lot of reasons people get involved in this. For me, it's about getting the best of analog, specifically oscillators and filters, being able to replicate classic sounds, unusual, hard to find sounds, and sounds that you can't replicate in a digital setting. So even when I'm creating electronic music, I start out in the traditional way. I write music down on paper, gather my materials, organize things, and while I don't know always how they're going to be orchestrated, it's a process that begins in a traditional way for me. So I want to work from the computer. I want a digital control over this analog modular collection of gear. So the way I've done that is I'm sending digital information from my computer into this digital synthesizer called the Hydrasynth, and that in turn is converting it into electronic control voltage, which feeds the modular piece of gear. So I can control this analog piece of gear from my computer.
One of the most interesting recent developments in electronic music is the introduction of computer-produced sound.
But in doing this, I asked myself, why am I not involving the Hydrasynth itself? I mean, it's a digital synthesizer, but it makes sound. And so that's exactly what I did. I built a complex evolving noise patch that, again, I can control digitally from the computer. But I'm sending that mono out of the Hydrasynth into the Moog Subsequent 37, which is another piece of analog gear. It's not a modular synthesizer. It's got a set signal path, but it is a analog piece of gear. So now I'm able to digitally control both the Hydrasynth and the Moog and filter the sound of the Hydrasynth through the Moog signal path. Another exciting part of this is I'm able to take concrete sounds or found recordings and send those through the Roland signal path or the Moog signal path. So that's a look behind the scenes at my process. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, be well.